So you gave this very nice reconstruction of Mill's argument. So there are two cases of ideas. Some are bad ideas. When you hear bad ideas, you can strengthen your own position. And when you hear good ideas, the good ideas will win out over the bad ideas. And it seems like a hidden presupposition, a hidden assumption in this argument is that good ideas win out over time. However, it seems like your whole talk was a discussion of how the good ideas are losing. And so I suppose my question is, why should we maintain this faith that good ideas will win out? And perhaps better yet, is there any reason to undermine this faith that good ideas will win out?
Oh, I mean, the faith gets undermined all the time, like all forms of faith. My own view is simply that in the long run, the good ideas win out. But the short run could be quite long. I mean, for instance, what I'm describing, I'm fairly confident that America will get back to a story of itself that is reasonable. And I'm confident about that because I think that in general, people want to have pride in things, and that's a necessary and legitimate thing. All peoples want to have pride in their country, and quite rightly so. And that Americans should have that right as much as anyone else in the world. So I'm fairly confident, actually, that the current sort of iconoclastic moment will pass. But it won't pass inevitably. It will pass by people challenging it at every dinner table, at every bar, and much more, and knowing more. And I think that's going to be an absolutely crucial thing, that Americans are involved in the debate about themselves and their past. But yes, in the short term, we were talking about this yesterday, in the short term, think of the devastating possibility that social media has for passing a lie around. You know, the famous Mark Twain quote about the lie going around the world before the truth has got its boots on. In the world of the internet, you know, if a significant person with significant following spun a lie tomorrow, that lie could go on it could go very far, very fast. And it would take a long time to pick it apart. But I think it could still be picked apart. It's better than the alternatives.
Well, and shouldn't we also realize that in recent times, some ideas have not lost, they have just been silenced and then sort of withdrawn from the debate. If you think about ideas surrounding, the early days of the pandemic or responses to it, or things of that nature.
Yeah, that's true. Anyhow, thank you.
I'm Connor Fraley. I'm at the law school here at UNC. I think I speak for maybe a lot of people at the school that we're quite thankful, one, that you're here, but two, also that Nicole Hannah-Jones declined a tenured position here because they hadn't initially offered her tenure. So we have not been inflicted by her.
Oh, that's right. I've forgotten that was here.
Yeah, that was here. So I think I speak for a lot.
Photo of me.
Oh my goodness, yeah. So that's a good thing. My question for you is, like, when you're talking about Europe, about the feeling there that the stories run out, how different do you think that is here? Obviously, we don't have the old aristocracy, the old money, the long histories here. Yet we seem to have this kind of cultural suicide kind of thing going. How different is Europe from here in terms of that feeling of cultural fatigue?
Yeah, I wrote about that in Strange Death of Europe. There's a word in German, which I don't know how many German speakers we might have here, but the German language is wonderful, as you know, for having words that English needs sentences for. And one of my favorites is a German word that translates into English as tiredness with history. It's a very, very telling thing that the German language would need this word. Tired, that history is tiring. It's an exhausting burden. Now, of course, as I say in The Strange Death of Europe, it's not a surprise that Germany would have such a feeling. I mean, Germany is still living in the period where the world is still trying to work out what happened in the 20th century. I mean, we're looking at, think about one of the interesting things, just to bear with me on this, but one of the amazing things about talking about Germans, about their own philosophy, for instance, is that you discover that they're still picking that apart like a crime scene. You know, certain philosophers are, they worry about. I mean, the most obvious one is Nietzsche. You know, whenever a student says to me, you know, I like Nietzsche, I always say, well, you've got to be specific. Which bits? This precision on this is going to matter. And I use Nietzsche a bit in The War on the West, and I always say very carefully, because he's an extraordinary and important thinker. But people also read Nietzsche and have terrible ideas. And yes, I mean, he was an extraordinary figure. But as I say, imagine living in a culture where you actually had the kind of level of suspicion that is now going on about the American past, but it was totally justified because you had the biggest catastrophe in history in living memory, and were still trying to work out why it happened. That would weigh on you, and it weighs on Germany. And Germany, being the most important power in Europe, means that it weighs on Europe. I've always hoped that America was different, and I think it is. I think it remains different. I hope that it remains different. I mean, the explanation for much of the ideological craziness of recent years has been that French theory, with a capital T, was sent to America. America spun it through America's racial identity politics and then sent it hurtling back at France, which said, we don't want this. But I mean, that's the intellectual movement of recent decades. A pretty fascinating thing to see. By the way, that's an interesting phenomenon. The French saying, that Macron himself said in 2020, not one statue or memorial will come down in France. We need all of our history. We need all of it. Very interesting. And he's not a right-wing maniac. Not by a long way.
You know, as Douglas points out, that German word that he's using, I guess the translation of it mean the tiredness of history. And this is how Germany is looking at its past, you know, presently. And I would say that in the United States of America, I wouldn't say it's a tiredness of history. I would say it's more of a retread, a rewrite of history, and then also a retiredness. In other words, they're trying to retire history here in the United States of America, trying to sweep it under the rug and then put their own spin on it, their own narrative, like the 1719 Project. Those kind of things to enhance the things that were happening in that period of time in the United States of America, the entire slavery issue, the founding fathers. Look at what's happening with the statues being torn down, boxed, carted away, paintings being removed of the Civil War, of you know, the pictures depicting the blacks on the plantations, you know, in the fields of cotton. You know, we've heard about where paintings are, like I said, just being, you know, removed from art galleries. And French President, like you said, French President Macron said, we are not going to do that at all. The history stays up, good or bad. And that's exactly what needs to be done. You can't be trying to, you know, because somebody was a leader in the Civil War, you know, from the South, because buildings are being named for generals, flags are being taken down, paintings being removed. You know, this just can't happen. You have to tell everybody about the history, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, without any type of a political spin, without any type of a narrative from left or right, just the facts. That's what needs to be done. And then perhaps that tiredness of history may just go away. But you have to have an open, honest discussion about that. And unfortunately, the players in this realm, especially those on the left, the progressives, the leftists, those bending towards a socialist Marxist, you know, ways, they don't want that at all. They only want to present it in their narrative from their narrow viewpoint, focusing in on all the ill that was done back in those days, all the things that were done, the inhumanity that was being conducted back then, viewing it with the moral judgment, the moral lens of 2024, the 21st century. And then on top of it, what better way to let people now and in the present know what went on back then so that those things can never be repeated. Anyways, folks, that's what's on tap for today. You're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. We're going to get back to the Q&A with Douglas Murray at the University of North Carolina. Let's get to it right now.
Fraley. I'm Connor Fraley's wife.
Oh.
So my question, when you're talking about like the faux public intellectual, I was reminded of Shelby Steele's White Guilt. And he talks about storming into the dean's office and he's ashing his cigarette on the carpet with all these demands with all the other Black students. And that, this was like a new thing that we could go and make these demands to people in power. And I was wondering if you think, like, is this the origin of this feeling, like the foothold that we can't argue with these people because they have there's some truth to the morality of their position.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't want to argue with them. And then has that just snowballed from that point to where you can't argue about gender or COVID or whatever it is?
Mm.
Is that the beginning?
Well, I mean, essentially, there's lots of problems in that. Have you ever seen the tape of Evergreen, the meltdown at Evergreen College? No, I don't know if anyone else has seen this. But it's quite remarkable. Some of the students in 2017, I wrote about it in the Madness of Crowds, stormed in because Brett Weinstein, the biologist, had done something that was completely innocuous, but which was presented by some students as being absolutely terrible and racist and so on. And they ended up in the dean's office, and the dean is like this cringing figure who at one point asks permission to go to the bathroom, and they deny him permission. It is, and one of them says, tie a knot in it or something. And eventually they allow him to go under escort. I mean, you watch this and you just cannot believe. I mean, you want to say this, Dean, effectively. I mean, how do you sleep at night after that embarrassment? After not standing up, after being so pathetic? Are you not embarrassed by yourself? I think he is now. But that was an example of a very significant factor in our society at the moment, which is older people being scared of the young. And that is a very modern thing. Old people did not used to be scared of young people. It was the other way around. In quite recent memory as well. And, I think that we just need to have a better understanding and think of the way in which our culture talks about old people. Think of the way in which a phrase like dead white men has been turned into this horrible commonplace phrase that we've allowed sort of deeply disrespectful things that dismiss everything from the past. As I always say, the dead white men thing is people who say it use white as an insult, use male as an insult, and they use dead as an insult, as if that was a stupid thing for them to do. Who would die? Well, total losers. On top of everything else, But if you think of the way in which we've allowed phrases like this and assumptions like this to just wash past us all. It's horrific when you think about it.
Hi, I'm Leanna. I'm a law student here at UNC. And a part in your talk that reminded me of an experience I had recently, the part where you said, you were talking about how authors very often take quotes and misconstrue them in a way to dismiss the person as a whole. I was in an interview recently where I mentioned in passing that I had listened to an audiobook about Winston Churchill. And the person interviewing me asked me whether I had a positive or negative reaction to him. And I kind of, said some of the things that made me have a positive reaction to him. And he followed up with asking whether I had considered in my positive attitude toward Winston Churchill about how he had done all these terrible things in Africa and Burma, and whether that changes my opinion at all. And I was wondering what you would say, like if you read it in a paper or in a book, that's one reaction you can have. But if you're confronted with it in a professional setting or in a more intellectual setting, how do you react to that kind of criticism?
It's horrible. It's a terrifying example. As I always say, Dante got it wrong. There's always another circle. I mean, you know, one problem from this is that, you know, you were listening to a book. If somebody says, have you considered all of these other ideas? You know, you might do with some people, but nobody can do with everyone. Like, we can't all become experts in everything. I mean, it's an expectation in the internet age that we are, you know, you're an expert in ivermectin and also lockdowns and also COVID and also history and all biology and everything. It's too much. None of us can really do this. The best shorthand way to do it, without getting specific, although I will come back to the specifics on Churchill, the best shorthand way to do it is to say, can we not look at people in the round? I mean, you know, one need not have a hagiographic attitude towards somebody, nor a totally dismissive attitude towards somebody. You would, being kindly to figures in the past and trying to understand them is necessary, among other things, because it's a preemptive request to the people who come after us to be kind to us in turn. We would want our successors to try to understand us. I mean, I have an editor, for instance, The Spectator in London, who always says to me that, well, he doesn't always say it to me, he said it to me, that every single era in history does stuff that we think is insane, and we just don't know why they do it. What were they thinking of? Like, what were the Spartans thinking of when they did this? What were the Victorians thinking of when they were shoving children up chimneys? What on earth? Don't they realize you're not meant to shove children up chimneys? You don't do that anymore. Now we look at that and we think, why didn't they know that? My friend and editor's point is, he says, work out, assume, since that's been the case with every civilization and every era in history, assume we are doing things now that our successors will look at with bafflement and say they were doing what in the 21st century? And try to work out what those things are now. And this is a very interesting challenge, actually. And it's one of the reasons why anyone here who's a writer or wants to be a writer, there's a lot to do. But on the specific of Churchill, by the way, it's a very interesting one. He's an example, like Jefferson, of somebody whose reputation has turned in a very short time span. There are a set of allegations against Winston Churchill which do the rounds now. Some of them are true. He said some things that undoubtedly by modern standards we would regard as racist. He had Victorian attitudes about a whole range of things because he was born in the Victorian era. I mean, if he had Victorian attitudes and he was born in, you know, 2010, we might think it odd, but he was born at the height of Victorian England. And but the specifics of the ones, as well as there being things that are said about Churchill that are true, there are criticisms made of him now that are wildly untrue. For instance, it's claimed that he was responsible for the Bengal famine in 1943, the terrible, terrible famine. He had no responsibility, obviously, for the cyclone that caused the famine, and did everything he could at the height of the war to get grain to Bengal from Australia. Thousands of people died. But it was not Winston Churchill's fault that they died. But here's the bigger thing in a way, which is, even if they had, even if Churchill didn't do enough to avoid the famine in 1943, when, you know, Japanese and German U-boats were patrolling the oceans, it should count as something in a man's favor if he does more than any other human being to destroy fascism.
You know, Douglas Murray is so right. The pummeling that Winston Churchill gets, who has been voted time and time again in the United Kingdom as the greatest Britainer who ever lived, and rightly so. for what he did, literally standing up to Hitler and fascism by himself and weathering that storm, really changed the course of what this world obviously now looks like, and should be given absolutely, all the accolades, all the applaud, you know, all the heroism and every success that occurred. And there were failures too. But this is what these historians try to do now. Those that want to, you know, downplay the role of Great Britain. They do the same thing here in the United States of America, pound on the founding fathers, go after them for their faults. Nothing that they did was ever right. Everything that they did had a race, bend to it. All of these things, okay, that we, see nowadays. And unfortunately, it's going to continue because there's a lot of people that don't like those figures from the past and judge them from the lens of the 21st century. And that's just not the way it should be done. As Douglas was saying there, every era has done things that is looked upon by the people that follow and say, how could you be doing that? How did you do that? What were you thinking? They're going to do it with us, folks. The things that we're doing right now in the 21st century, they're going to look in the future and say, how were they doing that? What were they thinking? I mean, they will be judged by the lens there. Is that what we want? Anyways, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. You all know what to do. Take a look at our other video links above and below. I'll leave you with my final thought, which is, when you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.